My name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University in St. Charles, Missouri, and this is a show called Insight. And what we do is discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally, sometimes historical books that provide some insight into the present, sometimes some broader atmospheric books that give a sense of broader issues and broader trends. This is a book addressing domestic issues. It's written by a man named Ken Wytsma, and the title of his book is called The Myth of Equality, Uncovering the Roots of Injustice and Privilege. Now, joining me on the show today are three Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Maria Sanchez. Maria. To Maria's right is Jessie Basler. And to Jessie's right is Anna Reynolds. So I wanted to read an opening quote, and then we jump into a discussion about the book. The author writes, "Privilege and responsibilities, these are the two themes of this book. I am not attempting to be the authoritative voice on race in America, and I only speak from a perspective of privilege and my experience. The central thesis of this book is that a misunderstanding of the gospel leads to a false dichotomy. We prioritize the spiritual and personal aspects of faith and devalue or nullify the material and communal dimensions that bind. This twisting of faith has resulted in historic injustices that have terrorized and handicapped generations of minorities. The result today is a society where we are deeply shaped by racial categories. Yet we who are white remain mostly blind to how the undercurrent of radicalized thinking affects our life as a nation and our own actions. Put another way, racism in the United States is worse than we thought. Its lasting consequences are more significant than we think, and our responsibility is greater than we've been taught."
Yeah, I think a key concept in that quote is referring to this lasting consequences that fuels much of his conversation of acknowledging privilege and responsibility as a white person, and it debunks this whole accepted concept that he refers to in his white Christian community, is referring to racism as an idea that exists today, and it fuels the actions of white people, of how they place certain groups historically in a disadvantage through institutions and policy. And it's not something that just existed in a situation of historic slavery and intensive segregation, because racism takes other forms that have been shown today, and just placing racism at its own variable and how it's practiced in other forms just reiterates this whole idea of that because it's not as tangible as it used to be, and it's not that, oh, you're black, you're a slave, and it's not put into such visible categories, doesn't mean racism disappeared. It's still existing in other forms, and it's internalized a lot, and it's recognizing that internalization, how we can move forward in discussing racism.
Exactly. The historical notions are that a lot of people, when they consider racism, they think of the 1950s, back to the Civil War, things that aren't present today, but racism is still present. But I like that he goes into kind of a bold move when I first introduced this book, is that a white man in a Christian community is going to explain racism to people. It's a bold thing because most people don't realize racism and privilege exists until they're on the other side of it, and the ostracized side of it. And so for him, it's a bold endeavor, but throughout the book I was pleased.
You both address the intersectionality of the author as both a white man and a Christian, which was, they're both places of privilege. So he addresses through these his personal responsibility and then his responsibility just as a community with both of those views, for the white and the Christian. Wytsma also yields the floor in this introduction that those, because he's a white man, he addresses that oftentimes people in places of privilege will say, well, not everyone has a voice. And Wytsma disagrees, that everyone does have a voice. It's just he'd like to investigate why certain people have been silenced or why their voices have been made less important. And throughout the book, that's what he seeks to investigate.
One of the themes I thought he was approaching is this issue he called shame versus truth-telling. And so he's saying, well, we don't have to shame, but we're trying to understand which is the truth-telling. And so as a result, that he's critical, I think, of what he sees if you put this into a make-believe liberal versus conservative setting, that conservatives are under the impression that we're going to shame you. And he says, oh, no, we're not. We're just trying to say, wait a second, let's take a look at what actually happened. And that's the truth-telling part.
Yeah, I think this is an aspect that I appreciated a lot in him clarifying this definition, because I know I've dealt with this a lot with discussing the privilege of being white with some of my white peers, and there's some, I can sense some shameness and some guiltiness that comes when I experience or disclose some of my experience with racism, and it's not about me wanting to make them feel guilty about their whiteness. It's not about that. It's how privileged they can do certain things. Just even getting asked more ID in a DMV is privileged, and that's recognizing, and at that point I feel obligated to point out that privilege because it's existing today, and it's by ignoring that sense, it's goes on to playing to their privileges of me even sometimes being discouraged of bringing up racism because they're sensitive or because they are uncomfortable, and it's pushing past that and having me saying something and having them recognizing. Because I know there's some examples that I reference to a lot is when my white peers encounter law enforcement, they get pulled over and they can joke around and they can have, they can even debate themselves out of tickets or speeding tickets. And when I suddenly ruin it when they feel guilty for being white because I can't do that, because I can't joke around, or I feel scared for my life when I even suggest the slightest form of retaliation of even joking or even feeling that there's argument, and having that's part of the privilege that I need to point out is that I can't have the ability to joke around with law enforcement because there's internalized fear for a reason from my history as physically looking like me. There's history of being mistreated and that such, and for them sometimes they forget that because it's not as common, it's not supported much from our law enforcement as much as it used to be, but it's that belief that's internalized.
Exactly. So a lot of times we have to idealize that shaming is intended to tear you down, it's to shame you, but truth-telling kind of builds you up. It helps you learn and kind of explore these ideals more. So truth is an absolute. You can't argue what the truth is and the facts. So people can't be expected to be perfect. We're all going to make mistakes, but the important thing is learning from those mistakes, looking at the truths, listening to people's experiences who have experienced it, and then being held responsible for your actions and what you proceed to do post that. And so the author goes into that in his book, is how to understand the history, understand the facts, and work from yourself as a singular perspective to better it.
Truth-telling is inherently messy, but it is with a purpose. As you mentioned, it's not just to tear people down. You have a purpose, you have an end goal in mind, which is, in this case, really to unify a community. And Wytsma uses America, parallels it to a patient that's going in for a medical checkup. And yes, you would expect to find things wrong, but the goal when you go to a medical checkup is once you find what's wrong, you want to fix what you find what's wrong. So in order to heal our nation and heal from the racism, you first have to discover why. You have to go in and say, hey, there is something wrong.
He has a good quote in here I liked. He said, how do we care about race without swinging to an extreme reaction such as blaming all cops because of the actions of some? Or how do we find it in ourselves to recognize our racial privilege even when our business is going bankrupt? We're working ourselves to the bone and we don't feel very privileged. I do not think I'm enlightened as a white guy who gets it, and I don't believe there are simple answers to fix the race problems in America.
This plays a lot because I know it goes into the notion of white privilege in the sense that some people, because they're white, their life was not hard, their life isn't hard and stuff like that, or makes it easier because they're white. And that's not the whole point of being white. That's not saying that your life wasn't hard or it cannot be hard or it isn't hard. It's realizing that your whiteness will not be a factor of what making your life hard. It's your whiteness not being a factor of why you're feeling difficulties. Mm-hmm. And because you can be white and have difficulty, you can be all that, but your whiteness is not going to be a factor into that. And so I think clarifying that in his book a lot is addressing that, acknowledging that the privilege that comes with it for being white, just that it's not going to be a factor in affecting you.
Exactly. When you're discussing privilege, it's not, oh, I'm making this much money and I have this mansion, this house. It's that like you said so eloquently, whiteness isn't the factor in your disprivileges versus people of color and people of minorities. That is a factor in their experiences. So it's also knowing that white privilege is just discussing how that you have a right to exist in a space that others don't, and that others face persecution for existing in the same space. So it's evening the playing field.
And I think you mentioned this in the quote originally, but that just in having conversations about white privilege, defensiveness will not play any relevant role. It will not help heal any conversations about privilege. And so acknowledging your privilege without becoming defensive and without saying, well, my life was hard too, just because, I'm white, or, your life really isn't hard because you're white, but my life was hard and I'm white. The defensiveness is not going to help you get past and to see things from other people's point of view.
Yeah, another quote he had that sort of gives a sense of what he's trying to get at. He said, I often hear news pundits or see social media posts claiming that although America has had a checkered past, we have progressed so far beyond our past mistakes that it is time for minorities to move on, to get over it.
I always find this really funny because it's something that, again, goes into acknowledging that racism is old history and it should stay as old history, and I should get over it because I'm not physically enslaved and we don't see physical enslavement of minorities, but it's the fact that I'm still feeling the effects of old racism and how it's taken new forms, and that's and how that racism was justified by our legal system, and that's the whole point, is that it was and it still is, and it's been internalized, and it's something that of course the system has changed for the better. I mean, with someone with my physical attributes, I prefer this lifetime much more than a decade and century ago. So it's changed for a lot better, but it still didn't address the whole notion of racism, and that's the whole point of this book, is ignoring that it's a belief that has been internalized and how we choose to ignore it, and it did not end when we decided to abolish slavery in our system.
Exactly. So the current state of our society is based on the history and actions of our past, and those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. So we need to know the history, we need to understand the ramifications, but we also need to realize that the consequences of our actions and the formation of our country, even our country was built on slaves. The fact that that is still present today, we still have the aspects of it and the groupthink and the mindset of it, we need to acknowledge that so we can move past it. If you choose to ignore it, you're going to repeat history.
He has discussions in here on immigrants. So he goes back to say, okay, you had a law passed 1790, and that to become a citizen, you had to be a free white person. And then he jumped ahead to an 1870 law where now you can have African background, or African descent was the use of the term, but that the idea was to still exclude Chinese and any other minorities. So he says it isn't really until 1952 that you finally get to the notion that now you don't have to be considered white to get citizenship. And so he addresses sort of the idea of how you look at the process of, if you're a nation of immigrants, that this is not actually true how you're looking at it in a diversified sense. Your history is more of white immigrants.
Mm-hmm. So understand that it's been less than 70 years that anyone non-white has consistently been given the rights of citizenship in America, less than 70 years. And so what Wytsma is stressing here is that ethnic minorities have been disallowed an identity, and I think that's really difficult for people in a place of white privilege to understand, because if you've always been given an identity, and not just that, but your identity has been rooted in a place of privilege and power, you're not going to possibly understand what it is like to have been disallowed an identity for that period of time. I mean, all the way up until 1952. That is recent history.
Exactly. It was the court's distribution. So the courts literally said that if you weren't born here or could pass as white and be identified by a court, you weren't a citizen. And it's not just, you get a badge that says you're a citizen. That determines your ability to own property, citizenship, voting, work, everything. And that accumulates to privilege, your ability to exist in a space and be a acceptable citizen by our standards and our court systems.
Yeah, and it plays onto that he goes on to emphasizing of the advantages of physically looking white, that you could be an immigrant and still be not experience the racist system, because he goes on to an example of his Dutch history, how his father and his grandparents were able to assimilate easy and not experience racist systems because they were deemed white by courts and they were deemed white by other white people, and seeing how it's different when you're an immigrant and you don't look white, you don't look culturally white, you don't look physically white, and it all plays along to this feature of the racist system that that was founded. And because I know it's uncommonly unheard of for someone who looks white and they're speaking non-English that there's no harassment going, but someone who looks who doesn't look white and speaks non-English, we hear lots of stories of harassment and such as that. So we see that there's difference in the advantage of physically looking white.
It was interesting, his insight on Shakespearean England. So he uses that as a way of saying how we began to see race emerge. So he says if you look at the writings of Shakespeare, race doesn't come across, and so he talks about Othello, and that Othello is black, but that you don't focus on his skin color. The idea is you're focusing simply on him as a military hero, or the Merchant of Venice, where what you're looking at is Jews, but there is an anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. And he says, but then after that, you're going to see the emergence of racial issues.
Yeah, this one was a really interesting point because I forget sometimes about like how it even started, but it shows a general broad theme of that we're still seeing the classification of people and beginning to categorize certain people and using this whole us versus them by it might not have been back then by the physicalities of how we see our skin, but it certainly still deals with identity and how we can devalue one group and make another group superior.
Exactly. That awareness is kind of difficult to note, so we have to base it off people like Shakespeare, who frequently wrote about current issues in his plays and tried to make comments on them and commentary, but he was also, burdened by community values. If he went too far, he would basically be shunned in his plays and things like that. But we also notice that there's theories of inferiority in modern language, in David Hume, even now in our sitcoms that people talk about it and they address it, but it's difficult to know exactly where that originated on without going into, plays and Shakespeare and literature.
Yeah, he says if you look at Aristotle addressed the idea there were different classes of people and slaves, but he didn't put it into an ethnic or a racial setting. So then he says we get to David Hume, who's writing in the 17th century, and Hume writes here, I am apt to suspect the Negroes and in general all other species of men to be naturally inferior to the whites. And so he says you've come a long way by the time you get to Hume from where Shakespeare was writing, so something had developed and evolved by that time.
Exactly, it was just the way they were describing it. So there were still inequalities, there were still like race wars, what we discussed that today. They just didn't call them that, they didn't identify them as that. So the modern meaning of race is like our physical peculiarities emerged around the 1700s in its novel, but it's still a new idea, and a lot of the theories of inferiority, which we find even now today, where people think that certain races are better at certain things than others, which has been proven false by science, it's still in the notions today, and it's still in our subconscious group thought. And that's because it predates our kind of modern definition, and it goes back into the history of people and comparing people and finding inequalities. But because we've put a label on it recently, it's begun to be more discussed and more focused on, which I think is helpful, but we're still not quite there yet.
Yeah, and putting this label that you refer to is, he goes on to talk about the white supremacy language, how now we have language and it's being used in a lot of academia and other fields. It makes people uncomfortable because now there is a label and now we know what exactly to look at. Mm-hmm. And so it's really interesting, which is part of also a way to address racism and how we can move and actually solve it or make some progress into some point is now we have labels, so now we have to acknowledge it instead of feeling defensive or reacting to the word white supremacy, because it's a reality that a lot of white people don't feel because you can be white and not racist, of course, but it's that you don't feel the effects of a system that was founded in white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
He addresses sort of what he sees that seeing differences in ethnic, racial, or associated with colonialism. Mm-hmm. So as European countries begin to colonize around the world, then they have to justify that based on the idea of being white and their religion, both Catholic and Protestant, so that this starts to create and sets in motion the notion of how we start to then develop how he sees how we look at race today.
So this is where Wytsma talks about religion being used badly, and Wytsma is a pastor, which is something that's really interesting about the way this book was written. And during colonialism, many of the colonizers were colonizing under the guise of just being the right of the religious. And they would use verse Matthew 28:19, therefore go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Lord. But colonialism was just not a gentle process. Contrary to what a lot of historians would like to believe, it wasn't. And they would use religious guise to justify a violent overthrow of just, the already local people. And these were people of color, and they would overthrow them simply because they weren't functioning within the bounds of Christianity. So then Christianity was being used to misappropriate its own religion for the purposes of gaining land, labor, and resources, which was completely and violently a white supremacist act.
Exactly, and in addition to religion, they also talk about white supremacy creating that opening for colonialism. So if we go back to anthropological sources, that finding those inequalities and claiming the inequalities that don't really exist, it gave them a right to infiltrate. It said, we'll control the barbarians, the savages, and we'll make things right, and we'll use our religion. But what they don't understand is that you're not just bringing religion in and trying to help a nation, you are leading to genocide, to slavery, to imperialism. You're destroying those nations in the name of your religion or your superiority.
He refers to a Supreme Court case, 1823, Johnson versus McIntosh. And so any legal rights that Native Americans have do not exist. And so the Supreme Court in that opinion said, we hold the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to New World's lands. So
this discrimination of Native Americans, it roots back to the discussion of how religion was used to justify these the mistreatment of Native Americans, and it goes with ignoring the problem that a lot of Christians today don't want to have this discussion that yes, their identity today might not reflect or support racist ideas now or in such a that, but it doesn't change the fact that it used to, and it doesn't change the fact that it fueled a lot of these accepted mistreatment to what he refers to the Native Americans, and forcing colonization on them, and forcing to assimilate to their standards, and disdaining their culture and whatnot. And so placing this distance and saying that, okay, we don't support this no more, and we are not that kind of Christians anymore, still doesn't change the fact that that used to be the accepted norm.
Exactly. The basis of our country was based on this racism, this imperialism. The doctrine of discovery basically said that we outweigh your rights of occupancy. So therefore, because we think we are superior and our religion and our ideas are better, the Native Americans who already live there didn't have a right to be there and continue their way of life. And so a lot of people are saying, our country was based on freedom. It was based on slavery, it was based on discrimination, and it was based on impeding this land that we did not have a right to simply because we thought we could.
He then moves on to look at black Americans. So he's looking at it from several different perspectives. One is a historical one, looking at sort of what he sees as a lost opportunity during Reconstruction, so the years right after the Civil War ends in 1865, so that you were sort of moving in the right direction in the South, and then suddenly it all went backwards with the end of Reconstruction and the movement towards Jim Crow and segregation.
This is a good point that he brings to reference history, that black or extremely dense black or brown communities didn't just pop up out of coincidence. It was due to a lot of policies that forced them to be overcrowded and forced them to certain situations. And one of them that he referenced a lot was the Chicago of having these certain sites be black dominated and white dominated, and it just wasn't because black people wanted to live with black people and white people wanted to live with white people. It was that a lot of white policy ignored black people from getting housing, and he mentions the Federal Housing Act that was implemented during the 1930s that denied a lot of black people from obtaining housing and forced them to certain areas, and that he does with redlining and addressing that it wasn't coincidence that we have segregation today and why there's certain intense black communities, because it was based on how we neglected certain privileges to certain communities.
And before even redlining, moving back to Jim Crow a little bit, many Americans are familiar with Jim Crow, but something that the author addresses are the black codes that were taking place in Mississippi, which were so blatantly racist, trying to really reenact slavery, if we're being perfectly honest, because in essence, black Americans were at this point jobless, and in the South, this is specifically taking place in Mississippi, as I said, and they were saying, okay, well, you have to get a job, except no white people were going to hire them. Okay, well, you don't have a job, so now we're going to put you in jail and have you work for chain gangs for no pay. So this was just a form of legalized slavery immediately after slavery had come to an end. So our racist history really did not get a whole lot better with Reconstruction, as a lot of historians would like to believe that it
Exactly, and it's the social aspect of it. So legally, yes, slavery was illegal, but people found ways around that. And we also have to look at the social aspect. So the people who were, for slavery still were here. They still existed. They simply didn't have the legal system on their side, so they found a way to do it. But you also have to understand is that the people during that era had children. They had their morals that they taught to their children, and so on and so on. And it becomes a generational curve, and that's why we have modern racism today, is because the people who thought it was right in the beginning, their generation still think it's right now. And so it kind of goes back to that systematic idea of our culture hasn't shifted, and as it hasn't been enough, and we're not doing anything to fix it.
We only have a few minutes left. What do you think of this book, and do you recommend it to the people watching this show?
Yes, I highly recommend it to what I think his intended audience is. These, especially white Christian communities, feeling uncomfortable having the discussion and placing such distance into our history. It's a good starting conversation to address racism and how our communities can move past that. So I do recommend it to the intended audience he put out to.
Exactly, with the idea of the intended audience. If you're going to read a book about race, you have to be open to the notions, and you're going to be open to having your feelings hurt. You probably have preconceived notions that are kind of racist, and you don't realize it. So if you're going to read this book, you need to be open, you need to be accepting of what they're going to tell you. But he has his facts, he has his history, he has his examples, and I think he does it in a way that eases you into understanding the perspective of people of color in a way that is easily understood. So I definitely recommend the book.
I would also recommend the book. It's going to make readers uncomfortable with their privilege, but being uncomfortable is the first step to just unpacking all of the pieces of racism and white supremacy in our nation, and just starting to listen to people who say, you know what, this is what I've been feeling my entire life, this is what I've been dealing with. And so then we're taking steps toward unifying our society, which is what the author is getting toward.
Yeah, I think it's a good book. I enjoyed his discussion on something called Dispensational Theology, which was this idea of thinking about the end times or end of the world. And he says that by doing that you're sort of finding a way around not trying to approach some of the social justice issues, so that you sort of come up with a different way of thinking, oh, no, we don't have to focus on anything because all we're focused on is end times. So now we don't need to talk about anything else. And his discussion on Downton Abbey, that was very good, because he talks about how you look at Downton Abbey and many people wanted to feel like inside of them they would love to be aristocracy, so that you therefore would like to sort of remove yourself from other people. So I thought those were sort of interesting aspects of this book. So he provided interesting perspective. So we all recommend the book, and thank you for joining us today.